The Kingdom of Hungary, after long centuries, finally gained its long-awaited independence at the end of the World War I. However, this was by no means the pleasant and wonderful independence full of various prospects and opportunities. No, instead, Hungary received the complete opposite: devastation, famine, economic crisis. And these were far from the worst consequences of the World War for the state. Perhaps one of the most terrible things that could happen to it was the Entente. What was wrong with it, you may ask? After all, during the Great War, its participants actively supported various nations, fighting for their independence, and they should have, in theory, supported Hungary as well, now free from Austrian rule. Logical? Well, it seems so. But the problem was that, at the start of the First World War, the Kingdom of Hungary formally had its own independence, and was in an equal union with Austria. Well, you do remember that it was Austria-Hungary that declared war on Serbia, meaning that this state was not only not considered dependent, but in the eyes of the Entente countries, it was actually one of the instigators of the war. Of course, we understand that although the state did have significant autonomy, it had no real freedom to either participate in or refuse the war. But everyone around it cared so little about that the great empires, upon the war's conclusion, still accused Hungary of aggressive behavior and burdened it with numerous obligations to reduce its army to a bare minimum, to pay reparations and contributions, to renounce the Habsburg monarchy, which was necessary to prevent the revival of the old empire. In short, Hungary now owed everything to everyone, while no one owed it anything at all. But even that was not the worst thing that could have happened to this country. After reducing its armed forces, all of Hungary's neighbors, realizing that it was incapable of self-defense, naturally decided to use their own armies to resolve some issues. The Slavic countries such as Czechoslovakia and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, which, by the way, for the rest of this video I will simply call Yugoslavia. Forgive me, but saying that full name every time, you get it. The Slavic nation were dissatisfied with the territorial division of the Austrian Empire, where Hungary was something of a favorite, receiving far too much land. And by the way, a lot of people get confused about this, but let's make it clear: Hungarians are not Slavs. Remember that. Hungarians and Slavs are like the left twigs and the right wing radicals. In short, nothing in common. The third country involved was Romania, but their frustration came from the fact that, at the end of the World War I, they received nothing, leaving them in a crisis. After all, they had spent far too much money and resources on the war. So, we have an army, you don't, so this land is ours now. Yoink! In the end, because of all these wars, Hungary lost around 70% of all its territory. That's an insane amount. A huge portion of the natural resources vital to its economy, a massive amount of industry, and, most importantly, access to the sea, which meant that Hungary could no longer export its goods to the global market. This completely cut it off from world trade, forcing it to rely on trade with its neighbors, who, as you can probably guess, was a rascal, absolutely hated Hungary and of course refused to trade on fair terms. Nightmare! Could the great empires intervene and help? Yes, and they do intervene, but only to demand reparation for starting the World War, as well as to confirm all territorial changes, which of course were not in favor of the Hungarians. This all happened under the so-called Treaty of Trianon, which was part of the Versailles system, a system that the Hungarians considered extremely unfair. They were clearly dissatisfied with this entire terrible situation, and all of it needed to be fixed. But the government kept changing constantly, flipping from one regime to another. There was no stability. And so, stability must be restored. The economy must be revived. The three evil neighbors must be defeated. The unjust treaties must be abolished, making Hungary independent from all great powers. Will this country manage to accomplish all that? Well, the situation finally calmed down by 1920, when after yet another change of regime, a conservative, monarchist and anti-communist named Miklos Horthy came to power, former vice admiral of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And yes, since Hungary lost access to the sea, this guy is now known as the admiral without a fleet. But that's not the only thing he is famous for. As soon as he took power, he immediately set the country on a path toward authoritarianism. Before him, Hungary had experienced both a democratic and a communistic government, so he believed that all the results of their work had to be destroyed. Communism was outlawed, and its followers were persecuted to the full extent of the law. Democratic institutes such as elections and voting were abolished, and to further strengthen his position, Horthy declared the return of the monarchy. He did this in a rather unique way. He knew that the Great Empire strictly forbade the restoration of the Habsburg dynasty, and so, while restoring the monarchy, he also understood perfectly well that this would provoke outrage from the great empires, who would threaten sanctions and war. That gave him the perfect excuse to convince his allies that it was impossible to put a Habsburg heir on the throne. Instead, the throne would remain empty with only a regent. And of course, he appointed himself as regent. And so, Miklos Horthy became not only an admiral without a fleet, but also regent without a king, holding essentially absolute power over the country. The funniest thing is that the rightful heirs to the throne still existed, and of course, upon hearing that a throne had been prepared for them, they tried to return to the country and claim it. But every time, they were politely escorted far away so they wouldn't get in the way, sometimes through arrests and repressions. Goodbye, we love you very much and can't wait to see you. Now get out. In the end, Horthy completely took control of the country's political life, eliminating any opposition. Now, it was time to think about how to get out of the economic crisis. Hungary's industry was in ruins. It had struggled even before the war. But back then, resources from all over the empire flowed into major cities, fueling industrial production. The finished products were then sold throughout the empire and across the world, stimulating further growth. But now, there were no resources. The empire itself no longer existed. The rich resource regions had been taken away by hostile neighbors, who were willing to sell them back, but at outrageously high prices. And even if Hungary could manage to produce anything, who would buy it? There was no access to the global ocean. The only non-hostile neighbors was Austria, but it had too many problems of its own to care. The other neighbors imposed huge tariffs. In short, there was just no point. All of this led to a disastrous economic collapse. The country was suffering from massive famine, and unemployment affected nearly 60% of urban residents. An absolute nightmare. However, rural peasants were doing just fine. They had food, they had work, and it was at this moment that Horthy realized this is exactly the direction Hungary should focus on. He launched an aggressive agricultural development policy, aiming to provide food for the population, jobs for the people, and possibly even exports to neighboring countries. And this time, he was absolutely right. At first, things went terribly. The economy was still in shambles. No one was investing in the country, and improving anything was extremely difficult. But soon, foreign buyers began to appear, and the first among them was Austria, which was also suffering from famine in its cities. Then came Poland, which had only recently appeared on the map and hadn't yet developed its own agriculture. But the most important customers were Italy and Germany. Both countries, deep in their own economic crisis, desperately needed grain, which Hungary could conveniently deliver through Austria, avoiding the crippling customs tariffs imposed by its enemy. But most importantly, both Italy and Germany, just like Hungary, were dissatisfied with the Versailles system, which restricted them and hindered their growth. Italy, for example, had its own grievances against Yugoslavia, just like Hungary. Germany had conflicts with Czechoslovakia, which Hungary's government found very concerning. inconvenient. Thus, economic and political alignments with these two powers become an invaluable opportunity for Hungary's long-term development and ambition. Everything was finally starting to improve, and soon, in 1933, even better news arrived. Germany's government had radicalized. They now had a new leader, who in addition to clashing with the great empires and undermining the Versailles system, was also heavily investing in industry, and in doing so, helping the Kingdom of Hungary as well. Our Miklos Horthy was so thrilled by this, that he might as well have been called Miklos Horny. And so, the two of them struck an extremely profitable deal. Hungarian grain was sent to Germany in enormous quantities, and in return, Germany didn't pay a single mark. So where was the profit? Instead of money, Germany paid in industrial goods. It supplied Hungary with machines and equipment for factories, providing the means to manufacture a wide range of products. They sent machines for producing all sorts of goods, lifting Hungary's industry up from rock bottom. And this was mutually beneficial. Not only were they getting exactly what they needed, but they were also acquiring it below market prices, literally using barter instead of currency exchange, just like in ancient times. Now, Hungary could finally declare that it had climbed out of its economic pit. The crisis was over. Hungary was capable of growth again. It had goods to sell on the global market. Thanks to Germany, it had factories and industrial plants that now allowed it to produce essential goods, including military equipment. And that meant one thing: Hungary could now reject the demilitarization restrictions and finally begin rebuilding its great army. It seems this trio will soon pay for their terrible deeds in the past. An ancient Eastern proverb says, "If you sit by the river long enough, you will see the body of your enemy float by." It seems the Hungarians understood this principle very well, and so they decided to use it to their advantage. The first of their three enemies turned out to be Czechoslovakia. After the World War I, Czechoslovakia had taken all of these territories from our main character, launched several military operations, and in general had behaved, let's say, harshly. But fortunately for Hungary, Czechoslovakia was not only a problem for them. I think you all know about the conflict between Czechoslovakia and Germany, so without getting into the details, I'll just say this: there were a lot of Germans living in Czechoslovakia. The country had huge raw material reserves and industrial hubs that the Third Reich desperately wanted. As a result, in 1938, Germany announced its desire to annex these territories. The major powers spent a long time debating the issue, loudly proclaiming that they would never allow poor little Czechoslovakia to be bullied. But in the end, they agreed to all the mustachioed man's demands. Germany went nyam, and then at that very moment, Hungary of course could not stay on the sidelines. During the international discussions, they reminded everyone that actually a lot of land had been taken from them too, so it would be quite fair to return it. And ideally, Hungary wanted all of Slovakia as well. Essentially, they just jumped on the bandwagon at the right time. But the Third Reich was more than happy to make these demands a reality, and for several reasons. First of all, weakening Czechoslovakia. With Hungary reclaiming its lands, Czechoslovakia's defense would be even weaker in case of any future conflicts. Sure, the great empires eventually decided not to interfere, but let's not forget that they could have. And in such a situation, the weaker the enemy, the better. Secondly, strengthening ties with Hungary. Ever since Hungary got its own arms factories, the Germans had started buying not only grain, but also weapons from them. This mutual trade in arms and resources made both countries even stronger. In the end, this is how Hungary managed to regain part of its lost territories without any military intervention. Soon, it would also annex Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which had attempted to declare independence. However, when Hungary moved its troops to the region, the locals collectively decided that joining Hungary actually seemed like a great idea. Good ideas, you know, often come to people when a gun is pointed at them. In the end, the first of the three enemies was defeated. The other two wouldn't be so easy. But then, World War II begins, a time of great change. But Romania, for example, appeared to be completely untouchable from a diplomatic standpoint. It had huge oil reserves, which Germany desperately wanted, especially during wartime. So Berlin worked hard to build friendly relations with Bucharest. But let's not forget, Romania was also a member of the Little Entente. From the beginning, it had been allied with the great powers, and as a result, it was now successfully playing both sides, taking the best deals from each one. Both sides gave Romania money, provided market access, and tried to win its favor. So taking anything from such a country seemed completely impossible. Of course, Hungary wanted to reclaim these lands, which Romania had seized after World War I, but there was simply no opportunity to do so. Romania secured its safety by befriending every major power, except the Soviet Union. And so, once again, Hungary sat by the river and watched as the corpses of its enemies flowed by. When the Soviet Union demanded these territories from Romania, the country was forced to agree, fearing the possibility of war with the communists. The powerful nations that had previously sought friendship with Romania were now faced with a choice. Were they ready to resist the Soviet Union under normal circumstances? Maybe they would have wanted to, but during World War II, when the great powers were already focused on destroying each other, nobody wanted to risk angering the Soviets, so they agreed. At the same time, Bulgaria decided this was the perfect opportunity to take its own share, and naturally, Hungary did the same, claiming this region, which Romania had won for itself after World War I. The allies of the anti-Hitler coalition simply couldn't do anything to help Romania. After all, simply saying "no, you can't do that" wouldn't stop anyone. To actually enforce it, they would have needed to deploy troops. But during a war against Germany, their armies had more urgent priorities. Sending troops to Romania would risk provoking the Soviet Union and damaging relations, something they wanted to avoid. Ironically, the Axis powers were thinking the exact same way. Nobody wanted to risk an accidental conflict with the Soviet Union, and if Romania was already suffering anyway, then in a possible dispute between Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary, it was better to side with the latter two. After all, Romania was already upset, it wouldn't get much worse. Hungary and Bulgaria, on the other hand, would grow even closer to Germany, and that's exactly what happened. Hungary officially joined the Axis, becoming Hitler's newest ally. So, in the end, everyone may have wanted to help Romania, but no one did. And that's how the Kingdom of Hungary acquired northern Transylvania. It was less than what they had hoped for, but honestly, not bad at all. After all, it was free. So, 2 out of 3 enemies have been eliminated. For fairness sake, only Yugoslavia remains. But things with Yugoslavia were different. Despite being an old enemy, it suddenly turned out that it wasn't that bad of a guy after all. Actually, a pretty normal dude, quite a pleasant one. Hungary had long established trade relations with Yugoslavia, buying and selling various goods, and during World War II, instead of hostility, the two countries actually started growing closer. Yugoslavia gradually distanced itself from its old allies and leaned more and more toward the Axis powers. For Hungary, this wasn't the best scenario, but knowing that its neighbor was no longer a sworn enemy, that was probably a nice feeling. In 1941, Hungary and Yugoslavia signed a friendship treaty, officially declaring themselves allies. And even more than that, friends! But then, just 4 months later, Yugoslavia decided to fully join the Axis, which sparked massive protest across the country. The uprising completely overturned the government, removing the leadership and installing a new regime. Now, Yugoslavia wanted nothing to do with Germany. Instead, it aligned itself with the British and the Soviets, agreed to mutual assistance. In this situation, Germany's attention naturally turned to the region, and the Wehrmacht immediately began preparation for an invasion. Hungary, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to expand its borders, and despite the friendship treaty they had just signed, Hungary mobilized its army for a full-scale invasion. That's some toxic friendship, huh? For the first first time, Hungary would have to get its hand dirty. I won't go into details about the invasion of Yugoslavia, but the result was the complete dismemberment of Yugoslavia. And at last, Hungary had taken revenge on every one of its former enemies. It had rebuilt its economy. It had punished all three of its hostile neighbors. Now, to achieve true greatness, Hungary only had one task left: to remain independent from the great empires. That, however, was about to become more difficult. Almost all of Europe was now controlled by this guy. Being independent from him was incredibly hard. Yeah, the Versailles system had been completely destroyed, but the new world was not looking any better. It just meant bowing to new players instead. Still, for now, luck was on Hungary's side, so the goal was clear: keep getting stronger and stronger to avoid falling like its former enemies. And thus it turned out. Hungary's new ally, or maybe its new threat, hard to say with this guy, you know, would soon provide just such an opportunity. On 22nd of June 1941, the Third Reich, using the full military industrial power of its state, launched an attack on the Soviet Union. For Germany, this was the opening of the Eastern Front, which was expected to end in a swift and decisive victory. For Hungary, this was yet another golden opportunity. When the staunch anti-communist Horthy heard about the war against the USSR, he was absolutely thrilled. And not just because he hated communists, but because this war opened up so many new possibilities. Germany now needed even more weapons and food, and Hungary was happy to produce and sell them. And then something happened. A Hungarian city was bombed. By whom? Well, no one was exactly sure. Theories were everywhere. Maybe it was the Soviets, Romanians, or Germans, Hungarians themselves, hell, maybe even the Slovaks. It could have literally been anyone. There were too many suspects. But in the end, it didn't matter. Hungary decided it was the Soviet Union, and so the response was immediate. Hungary entered the war. It was expected that the war would end quickly, and in reality, by September, after just 4 months, German forces had already reached the Soviet capital. This meant that little Hungary, now that it had joined the war, would quickly gain its fair share of rewards, whether in the form of territory, war trophies, or economic benefits. But the war wasn't in any rush to end. The Soviet Union, having defended its capital, shifted into effective defense and showed no signs of collapsing. And because of this, Hungary wasn't receiving any of the spoils of victory. Hungary was not ready for a prolonged war, not even so much militarily. After all, it was not like much depended on them, but rather politically. Its military ally, the Third Reich, was determined to win at any cost. And so, of course, it began pressuring Hungary more and more. The relation between the two gradually soured, but only Hungary suffered from this, thus it became more and more dependent on Germany. Hungary's economy was forcibly converted into a wartime economy under pressure from its larger neighbor. Hungary's economy was forcibly converted into a wartime economy under pressure from its larger neighbor. This negatively affected the country's economic well-being. At first, Hungary produced only as much as it found profitable to sell, but now it was forced to produce more and more, draining its resources without bringing in enough profit. But what could Hungary do? Now Germany was the clear hegemon, and things would go exactly as Germany wanted. It had military leverage, it had economic control. Hungary simply couldn't say no. A difficult situation. This wasn't what Horthy wanted at all. The last and most important goal had not been achieved. Hungary had always wanted to correct this mistake. It even tried negotiating with the allies, promising that if they signed a peace agreement now, Hungary would switch sides during a possible invasion of Greece. It did not work. With each passing year, Hungary became more and more dependent on the First Reich. With each passing year, Hungary had less and less control over its own decisions. And when the Soviet Union finally shifted from defense to offense, Hungary found it nearly impossible to maintain any sort of autonomy. By early 1944, as the Soviets reached their own borders, Hitler sent German troops into Hungary not to fight Hungary, but to prevent it from making independent independent decisions. After all, with defeats piling up on every front, Hungary might have tried to exit the war early, which would have only made things worse for Germany, and Germany wasn't ready to surrender. Or rather, it simply couldn't. How did Horthy even allow German troops in, if he wanted to stay independent? Well, he didn't. They didn't even ask him. Germany pulled off a clever trick. They invited Horthy to a negotiation, and while he was away, they moved their troops in. Now that the head of state was surrounded, Horthy was forced to make exactly the decisions the Wehrmacht wanted, and not all of those decisions were in Hungary's best interest. But hey, good ideas, you know, often come to people when a gun is pointed at them. Hungary still wanted to escape the war. Secretly, Miklos Horthy continued negotiating with the Soviet Union, because, as you can imagine, Hungary had absolutely no reason to keep fighting. There was nothing left to gain. The Soviets were advancing rapidly. It was time to jump ship before it completely sank. Except Hungary didn't have a sea to escape through. Not great for an admiral. Horthy tried to negotiate with the Soviets through his son, Miklos Horthy, who traveled for the secret meetings. But the Third Reich caught Miklos Horthy, and they told Miklos Horthy that they had Miklos Horthy. So Miklos Horthy should not try to negotiate with the Soviets using Miklos Horthy, and that actually Miklos Horthy was now fired. Miklos Horthy. And yes, they actually did it. By kidnapping the leader's son, Germany pressured Horthy into abdicating in favor of a pro-Nazi prime minister. Germany literally fired the ruler of an allied country. I mean, sure, it's not the worst thing Hitler ever did, but still, let's just say it was not friendly. Now, Hungary had completely lost any hope of independence. It no longer had any say in its decisions. Now, it was entirely in Nazi hands. But there was no need to worry about that, because very soon, in just 1 year, the Third Reich would collapse, and Hungary would finally regain its independence. Or become communist. Oh, oops, yeah. World War II did not go well for Hungary. The war itself and the actions of its former ally completely ruined its economy again. It would take years to recover. Its territorial gains were all lost. Any hope of true independence was gone. Now, Hungary was communist, but not like before. No. Now, Hungary had to answer to the Soviet Union, which strictly controlled the country, enforcing its rule through military power. And those three evil neighbors, well, they were all alive again. They were all communists now too. And they were no longer evil neighbors. Now they were товарищ. So, was that good or bad? I think you already know the answer. But one thing is certain. Not a single goal from Hungary's original plan was ever fully achieved. Not even one. Thank you for watching, friends. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. And of course, I would really appreciate it if you left a like and a comment.